All right, what is up, everybody? Um, Today I am going to be going through first and second apologies of Justin Martyr, not as an exhaustive, explanation or breakdown, just on points that I personally found interesting. So yeah, let's get into it. Huh? A little backdrop: Justin Martyr lived in 100 A.D. to 160 A.D. So the last apostle that died was John. He died of old age. The rest of them were martyred, crucified, all kinds of craziness, beheaded. Uh, anyway, they say that John died either 98 or 99 AD. So Justin Martyr, that's not his real last name. They gave that to him posthumously because he was martyred. Justin Martyr was born in 100 AD and died in 160. So this would have been shortly after the original apostles were all gone, which is very interesting to me. So while he never met the apostles, it's definitely possible that he knew people who did. Like, this is second generation Christianity. And, and so this is from the first and second apology of Justin Martyr. Apology meaning like apologetics, which is like to defend the faith. So his purpose in writing this letter, he's writing it to a Roman emperor and explaining what Christianity is, because the Romans are persecuting Christians actively at this time, which it was kind of like pockets of persecution, because you can see, like in Paul. So he's being, when he's headed to Rome, where he's ultimately beheaded, history says that he's communicating with Christians on his way there. And that's because, like in this province or portion of Rome, which Rome was massive at the time, in this section of Rome, Christians are persecuted, but then they would move through sections where they're not. So he could just talk to these people. Anyway, so Justin's making the case to the Roman emperor as to why Christians shouldn't be persecuted at all. That's the backdrop for the entire letters here, because that's what they are, is they are letters to the emperor of Rome at the time. So again, this isn't an exhaustive study. These are just points that I personally was like, dang, that's interesting. Like, things that were my personal interests, not I wasn't studying to make this video while I was going through it. This was just for me. So in chapter 5, um, Justin explains that it's really demons that were labeled as gods that revealed themselves to people, and people were calling them by the names that the demons chose for themselves. Now, it's important to remember that he's saying this to a Roman emperor. So he's telling this, who worshiped the Roman gods, he's telling this emperor, you worship demons, which is crazy. So then later in chapter 9, he says that the idols and the images that they were making, where they worshipped these gods, were made in the image of the demons as they appeared to people. Which again, both of these are things that, like, I know. I've studied this kind of stuff a lot, and it just seems kind of like apparent to me. But this has really been lost in Western Christianity. Like, this was coming out of Judaism and into first, second generation Christianity. This stuff didn't have to be explained to them because they were living in this culturally. So, like, Hindu to this day believes that the spirits of their gods inhabit the idols, the statues and whatever that they worship at. Like, that was common belief, that's how it is supposed to. That's how it works. Is the spirits inhabit these idols, and then Justin is saying that the idols are literally made in the image of these demons that reveal themselves to these people. Crazy, right? So then, in chapter 14, he talks about demons intentionally misrepresenting Christian doctrine, which of course they did. But then he states that demons strive to hold you their slaves and servants, and sometimes by appearances and dreams, and sometimes by magical impositions, they subdue all who make no strong opposing effort for their own salvation. How wild. So he says that these demons show up in dreams or by magical impositions, which think about, like, to this day, there's this whole spirit guide thing going on in New Age. All these guys going down to like South America and doing ayahuasca and DMT and whatever to get in contact with the spirit. Like he says that they subdue all who make no strong opposing effort for their salvation. So he's talking to Christians there. Like these demons will show up, and if you aren't actually fighting for your faith, they just subdue you. Ephesians 6:12, right? For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, uh, rulers of darkness in this age, spiritual wickedness in high places, depending on the translation. So you got to be ready to wrestle demons in the spirit. And he's saying if you're not putting up a strong effort, they're going to subdue you. All right. So then in chapter 23, he says that through the influence of demons, the poets, which would be like Homer, the people making the stories about these false gods, the demon gods, that the demons have intentionally aimed to dilute the message of Christ. So he goes on to explain later that Moses and all the prophets are happening. So these demons are in the area and they hear these prophetic words go out. And they grab a hold of it and they start twisting it and promoting their twisted version in the areas where like the Judaism, Moses and all them came through. Israel came through. So they hear the prophecies and they grab them and they start perverting them. And this is before Jesus is even on earth. Okay? So there was actually a fairly large jump before I wrote anything else down because, like I said, what he's doing is defending the faith and explaining the faith to the Roman emperor. And like, I don't need the faith explained to me. I just think it's an awesome document. But there are some interesting things, so that I wrote those down. The next one I had is in chapter 39. And he literally says that the 12 original apostles, he uses the word illiterate. That's the word he uses. Which I was like, wow, that implies that these guys couldn't read. Like I said, he lived right after John died. Like literally, he was born the next year or something. The apostles weren't far removed from him. I mean, he could have known for real that the apostles couldn't read. And then, it made me think of in Acts 4:13, it says that Peter and John were unlearned and ignorant. And historically speaking, the facts that they had taken up their father's trades, like Peter was a fisherman, the fact that they had already taken up trades means that they failed out of Hebrew school. Like they were done with that. That's what it means. Because if they had continued in school, then they would be scholars and scribes and those types of things. But they're not. These guys are fishermen and whatever. The only one I'm not sure about is Matthew. He's a tax collector. Kind of seems. But I mean, Justin said all 12 of them were illiterate. Whatever. Yeah, a lot of people like scholars, historians now say that the apostles were not formally educated, which is like I said, they had already failed out of Hebrew school or whatever. they would have a rabbi study under them and then do what the rabbi did and become uh, scholars and scribes. And anyway, so I can't help but wonder, like, I know it's hard for us to imagine that the apostles, that the 12 were illiterate, couldn't read, because it's like, uh, you know, I'm sure it was then too, to an extent, but like if you can't read now, that's like a big deal. But these guys were uneducated, so it's quite possible they couldn't read, at least some of them. And if you didn't know that there is a lot of scholars, biblical scholars, think that the Gospel of Mark is really the Gospel of Peter, because Mark wasn't there during the life of Jesus, as far as we know. Like, it's not documented that he's there. So they think that the Gospel of Mark is the Gospel of Peter, just penned by Mark. Same with Luke. The Gospel of Luke wasn't there. Luke just wrote it down. Somebody told him, he wrote it. I believe he actually like collected a bunch of the testimonies of people, and then wrote down the life of Jesus. So the next thing I had is in chapter 43, and Justin makes an argument against predestination. So once again, interesting to me, Justin lived from 100 AD to 160 AD. And then there's what's called Calvinism, and that is heavy on predestination. And that didn't surface till the 16th century, which is 1500 AD. So 1400 years later, roughly. But Justin says, if all things happen by fate, neither is anything at all in our power. So predestination is the concept that no matter what you do, you are going to end up at a predestined spot. Like, you are going to be brought to a certain spot no matter what you do. And Justin says that if everything happens by fate, then nothing is in our power. Then he says, unless they have the power of avoiding evil and choosing good by free choice, they are not accountable for their actions of whichever kind they may be. So Justin thought that predestination was counterintuitive to the gospel, to the Bible. And this was Jesus supposedly died in 33 AD, right? If he was born in 0, he lived 33 years, died. So this was sometime, before 160. I don't know what year this was written in, but so Justin is arguing against predestination sometime between the year 100 and 160. Like I said, Calvinism surfaces in the 1500s. And so briefly, Calvinism believes that people can't know anything about God except through the Word. Like, they don't know, no prophets, no, they don't even believe you can hear from God, right? But yet the Word says, my sheep know my voice, and they will not follow another. So to me, scripturally, that's off. The Bible says we can hear from God. So to argue that we can't know anything about God aside from the Word, when the Word says that we can hear from God, it's silly. That's a weird theology to me. And last, Calvinism is also considered Reformed theology. It's like the father of Reformed theology in some ways, some respects. And most, if not all people who are considered reformed at this point are cessationist, meaning they believe that the Holy Ghost, the gifts of the Spirit, are no longer in operation today. Now, I have heard of charismatic Calvinist. I've heard that term. That apparently is a thing. Charismatic meaning charismata, which is the gifts of the Spirit. So, there's some theological backdrop there. So, again, in chapter 54, Justin makes the point that the demons heard the message of the coming Christ through the prophecies given, like Isaiah. Even David was prophesying about the coming Christ. He prophesied about crucifixion of the Christ, and crucifixion wasn't even invented yet for like thousands of years, I think. So he states that the demons heard the message of the coming Christ from the prophets and then went and produced similar tales through the poets, so like Homer and other people, he's just the most famous, in order to persuade people that the stories of Jesus were just marvelous tales, like the rest of the stories about the gods. And it's worked. It's worked extremely well. So even that, like one of the arguments I've always heard, like Krishna has the same like story as Christ, and one of the Egyptian gods, I think it's Horus. Don't hold me to that, but same story, and that's because Christ was prophesied before, and the demons knew this story, and they were perverting it. All right. So, and then again in chapter 57, Justin talks about Christians endeavor to lead the very people that hate us to repentance. And the hate that those people have is stirred up by the demons. And for some reason, like the scope of the wickedness of that just hit me different than it ever had. So, like, if someone that is atheist kills someone, they believe that they're just erasing that person. They're just done. They're gone. Poof. God, how evil, like. And then even on the other side, like if a Christian kills an evil person, they believe they're sending that person to hell. And maybe it's not by choice, maybe it's defense, whatever, but like that's the case. But the atheist just literally thinks I don't like this person. They're gone now. They don't exist anymore. Like, how crazy. In chapter 58, he points out that heretics are also raised up by demons. And Justin lived at the same time as a dude named Marcion, he started Marcionism, which was so big that all the early church fathers took time to write about Marcionism and the dangers of it. And it would straight up be considered a doctrine of demons, as the Bible talks about. So this next part was entirely new to me. But in chapters 62 and 63, he states that the Jews were mistaken when they thought that Moses talked to God in the burning bush. And he says that it was, in fact, Jesus speaking to him through the burning bush. He cites Isaiah 1 and 3 and Matthew 11:27. I never thought about this before. To a certain extent, it makes sense to me because in John 1 and 8, he says that Jesus says that no man has seen the Father. No man has seen God except the Son, which would be a contradiction of Exodus 33 and 11, which is where God says that he speaks with Moses face to face. So I think there's actually weight to that argument. Personally, I'm not saying I'm convinced. I'm saying maybe, because like I said in Exodus, it says that God spoke with Moses face to face, but then Jesus says that no man has seen God. How can you speak with someone face to face if you don't see him? Unless it's Jesus instead of the Father. Like, it's really interesting to me that in my mind there's plausibility that like the Father God never directly spoke to anybody. And it was always just Jesus. Like all them times in the Old Testament where it's the angel of the Lord, like it's pretty common for people to think that that's Jesus. I've heard there's a book called The Unseen Realm by Michael Heisner, and he talks about where he thinks that the angel of the Lord is literally Yahweh in physical form, but that's what Jesus is. So uh, it's all kind of weird theological arguments there, but it's intriguing. So then, in chapter 65, Justin is describing the way that they did communion. And I noted a couple things. One of them is he says that the giving of thanks is of quote considerable length. Like they pray they pray over this for quite a while. Uh, Another thing that was interesting to me was that he says that they carry away portions for those who weren't present, which you don't see that anymore. Like these guys were having like an actual feast, by the way. This wasn't no cracker and a tiny cup of wine or juice like we do today. They had a whole table set up. So they would pray, they'd give thanks for quite a while, and then when it was all over, they would carry away portions to bring to people who weren't in attendance. He also repeatedly says that the wine was mixed with water, says it over and over again, like 5 different times. And then last thing I have for the first apology of Justin Martyr is in chapter 57, he speaks repeatedly of a president that leads the meetings of the Christians. Um, they read the scriptures for, quote, as long as time permits. And then the president instructs and exhorts, then prays over communion, and the collection goes to him. And then he takes the collection and distributes it out to orphans and widows and the sick and those in prison and stuff. So the president is like what we call pastors today, but there's no mention of a pastor in this letter from Justin Martyr. They call it a president, which again, I'm just tap over this real quick, but like the structure by which we have church nowadays is not in the Bible. There's no description in the Bible of how to hold a church service. All right, so this is the second apology of Justin Martyr. It was significantly shorter, and so are my notes. But in chapter 4, uh, Justin addresses why Christians don't just kill themselves and go to God. And because that's what all the Romans are wondering at this time. They're like, if you just want to go to God, then just kill yourself and go to God. If you go to God when you die, then just kill yourself and you'll go. And so his response is that if we kill ourselves, we can't spread the gospel, which is in opposition to the will of God. Which, you know, obviously at this point in history, there's a whole lot more wrapped around that, but it's interesting that like now this isn't like, oh, you're depressed or something like that. They're straight up like, why don't you just go straight to God? And he's like, this is why. In chapter 5, it is straight up what they call Enochian theology, which is from the book of Enoch. Like everything about chapter 5 of the second apology of Justin Martyr is straight up book of Enoch. Hang on a second. So I'm probably going to read most of this. So it's titled How the Angels Transgressed. Okay. And he says that God subjected the whole earth to man, and arranged heavenly elements for the increase of fruits and rotation of the seasons, and appointed this divine law for these things. He also evidently made man. He committed the care of men and of all things under heaven to angels, whom he appointed over them. Then the angels transgressed and were captivated by the love of women, and begat children, who are those that are called demons. And besides, they afterwards subdued the human race to themselves, partly by magical writings, and partly by fears and the punishments they occasioned, and partly by teaching them to offer sacrifices as to like to idols, to false gods, and incense and libations, of which things they stood in need after they were enslaved by lustful passions. And among men they sowed murders, wars, adulteries, intemperate deeds, and all wickedness. Whence also the poets and mythologists, not knowing that it was the angels and those demons who had been begotten by them, that did these things to men and women and cities and nations which they related, ascribed them to God himself, and to those who were accounted to be his very offspring. So, like I said, this is full blown Enochian theology. I'm just going to tap over this real quick. But part of that is, he says, so part of this is in Genesis 6 too. So God makes the earth and subjects it to man. Then he sets certain angels over certain regions of the earth. Now, I believe that's all in Genesis 6. And then this part is too. So they fell in love with women, or lusted after women is more appropriate, and then made children with the women, which were the Nephilim. So Enochian theology is that demons are actually the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim. And that fallen angels are something entirely different. A fallen angel is a fallen angel, but a demon is a disembodied spirit of the Nephilim in Enochian theology, which there's different periods. So during the Second Temple period in Israel, everybody knew the Book of Enoch. I'm treading lightly here, but during that time period, everybody knew the Book of Enoch. So this was not new. This wasn't a new concept to them. They all knew it. And even the part that I just read about where he orchestrates all the seasons and this and that, that's all in the Book of Enoch. That's all in there. If you have not thoroughly studied Genesis to Revelation, do not worry about the Book of Enoch. You have no business being there. Read the Bible. But, yeah, everything he just said is straight up Book of Enoch. All right, so in chapter 9, he briefly touches on philosophers, even at that time, were suggesting that, quote, we wish men to live virtuously through fear, meaning Christians, that we wish people to do the right thing because of fear and not because that doing the right thing, living by God's law or rules is good and pleasant. In chapter 10, he states that Socrates was actually denouncing the demon gods and poets and philosophers like Homer and urging people to seek out capital G God. And he even said that it is neither easy to find the Father and Maker of all, nor, having found him, is it safe to declare him to all. That's the last thing I have on it, but like, I had no idea that Socrates was teaching those type of things. Like he was like, it's not safe to declare the Father and Maker of all. So like, how crazy is that? Now he lived, it was like 400 BC, so this was before Jesus. He couldn't have possibly been a Christian. So I can't help but wonder, like, did Socrates get saved? Because the rules were different back then. Like this is pre Christ. Did Socrates get saved? Anyway, those are my takeaways from the first and second apology of Justin Martyr. Um, if you're into that kind of thing, I would suggest you read it yourself because it's pretty awesome and it's real short. Both of them together was like, I don't know, 74 pages for both of them, and it's a lot of good stuff as far as like how to structure arguments, or not to argue, but like to structure an argument to people who are in opposition to Christianity. I mean, it's like the original manuscript of apologetics. If you're into apologetics, check out Justin Martyr's first and second apology. All right, that's what I got. Peace.